Lonely Lumberjack rescued the girl called Daughter of the Devil and called her his miracle. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers as Samuel Hartwell swung his axe with practiced precision. Each strike echoed through the Montana wilderness, a rhythmic song that had become the soundtrack of his solitary existence. At 42, Sam's hands were as rough as tree bark, his shoulders broad from years of felling timber, and his heart as guarded as the mountain peaks that surrounded his modest cabin. 3 years had passed since he'd last spoken to another human being. 3 years since he'd buried his wife Martha and their infant son Thomas, victims of a cholera outbreak that had swept through the mining town of Copper Falls. The pain had driven him here, to this remote corner of the Rockies, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through evergreens and the crack of splitting wood. Sam paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the October chill. The sky above was a tapestry of gray clouds, threatening snow before the week's end. He'd need to finish cutting and stacking enough firewood to last through the harsh Montana winter. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to memories that cut deeper than any blade. As he reached for another log, an unfamiliar sound drifted through the forest, a weak, desperate cry that made his blood run cold. Sam froze, his axe suspended mid-swing. Animals didn't make sounds like that. Neither did the wind. "Help!" The voice was barely a whisper carried on the autumn breeze. "Please." Sam's first instinct was to ignore it. He'd come to these mountains to escape human contact, not to invite it back into his life. But something in that voice, young, frightened, and fading, tugged at a part of his heart he'd thought permanently buried. Against his better judgment, Sam set down his axe and followed the sound. His boots crunched through fallen leaves as he made his way deeper into the forest, past towering Douglas firs and over fallen logs slick with morning dew. The voice grew weaker with each step, until he wondered if he'd imagined it altogether. Then he saw her. At the base of a massive pine tree partially hidden by a tangle of branches and autumn brush, lay a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, her slight frame wrapped in a torn and dirty dress that might have once been blue. Her skin was pale as fresh snow, marked with cuts and bruises, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. But it was her appearance that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. Her hair was the color of autumn flames, cascading in wild waves around her shoulders. More striking still were her eyes. One green as spring grass, the other blue as a summer sky. Even in her weakened state, those mismatched eyes held an intelligence and intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They said I was cursed. They left me here to die." Sam knelt beside her, his heart pounding. Up close he could see she was severely dehydrated and likely hadn't eaten in days. Her lips were cracked, her clothes were torn in several places, and there were rope burns around her wrists that suggested she'd been bound. "Who did this to you?" Sam asked, his voice rusty from disuse. The girl's eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on his face. "The town, Copper Falls. They said I killed my family. They said I was the devil's daughter." A tear rolled down her dirt-stained cheek. "But I didn't. I swear I didn't." Copper Falls. Sam's jaw tightened. The same town where his wife and son had died, where superstition and fear often ruled over reason. He'd heard whispers before he'd left. Talk of a family found dead in their home, of a surviving daughter with devil's eyes who disappeared into the night. "What's your name?" Sam asked gently. "Evangeline," she whispered. "Evangeline Morrison." Sam remembered the Morrisons now, a quiet family who'd kept to themselves. The father a struggling merchant, the mother a seamstress. They'd been found dead in their home, apparently from some kind of poisoning. The townspeople had blamed the surviving daughter, convinced that her unusual appearance was a mark of evil. "Can you sit up?" Sam asked, sliding his arm carefully under her shoulders. Evangeline tried but gasped in pain, her body too weak to support itself. Sam could see she wouldn't last another night in the wilderness. The temperature was dropping, and she was already showing signs of exposure. Without hesitation, Sam scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body fragile as a bird's. "I'm taking you to my cabin," he said firmly. "You're safe now." As he carried her through the forest, Evangeline's head lolled against his chest. "Why?" she murmured. "Why would you help me?" Everyone says I'm cursed. Sam looked down at her pale face, at those remarkable eyes that had likely sealed her fate in a town full of frightened, superstitious people. Because, he said quietly, I don't believe in curses, only in cruelty disguised as righteousness. The cabin came into view through the trees. A simple structure Sam had built with his own hands, surrounded by neat stacks of firewood and a small vegetable garden. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. As Sam carried Evangeline across the threshold, he felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. For 3 years he'd existed in isolation, convinced that solitude was his only refuge from pain. But now, holding this broken girl who'd been cast out by the very people who should have protected her, he realized that sometimes salvation came not from running away from the world, but from opening your door to someone who needed shelter even more than you did. You're going to be all right, Sam whispered as he laid Evangeline gently on his bed. I promise you that. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of coming snow. Winter was approaching fast, and with it, the long months of isolation that had become Sam's routine. But this winter would be different. This winter he wouldn't be alone. As he began tending to Evangeline's wounds, Sam found himself wondering if perhaps he'd been wrong about miracles. Maybe they didn't always come in the form of answered prayers or divine intervention. Maybe sometimes they came disguised as the very people the world had given up on, broken, scared, and desperately in need of someone to believe in them. The firelight flickered across Evangeline's face as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, and for the first time in 3 years, Sam Hartwell felt something he'd thought lost forever: hope. 3 days passed before Evangeline was strong enough to sit up without assistance. Sam had spent those days moving quietly around his cabin, brewing broths from wild herbs Martha had once taught him to gather, changing bandages, and keeping the fire burning steady against the October cold that had settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. He'd watched her sleep fitfully, sometimes crying out in the night, fragments of words that painted a picture of terror and loss. "Papa, no," she'd whisper, "or I didn't do it, please believe me." Each tortured cry had driven another nail into Sam's growing certainty that this girl was no demon, but simply another victim of Copper Fall's capacity for cruelty. On the 4th morning, Sam found Evangeline sitting up in bed, her mismatched eyes alert and focused as she studied her surroundings. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she was still painfully thin, she no longer looked like she was knocking on death's door. "How long have I been here?" she asked, her voice stronger now but still carrying that note of wariness Sam was beginning to recognize as her default state. 4 days, Sam replied from where he stood at the stove, stirring a pot of rabbit stew. "You were pretty near gone when I found you." Evangeline pulled the quilt up to her chin, suddenly self-conscious. "I should go. I've imposed on your kindness long enough." Sam turned to face her, ladle still in his hand. "Go where exactly? Winter's coming fast and you're in no condition to survive on your own." "Anywhere but here," Evangeline said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She stood shakily, gripping the bedpost for support. "You don't understand what they say about me, what they believe. If they find out you're helping me—" "Let me worry about that," Sam interrupted. "Right now, you need to eat and get your strength back." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. Evangeline accepted it with trembling hands, and Sam noticed the way she hunched her shoulders, making herself as small as possible. It was a posture he recognized, the defensive crouch of someone who'd learned to expect blows instead of kindness. "Tell me what really happened to your family," Sam said gently, settling into the chair beside the bed. Evangeline's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "You won't believe me. No one ever does. Try me." For a long moment she stared into the stew as if searching for answers in its depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father had been acting strange for weeks before it happened. He'd come home from his store talking about debts, about men who'd been threatening him. Said he owed money to some bad people from the territorial capital." She took a shaky breath. "Mama was worried sick. She kept asking him what we were going to do, but Papa just got angry and told her to mind her own business." Sam leaned forward, sensing there was more to the story. "The night they died," Evangeline continued, her knuckles white as she gripped the spoon. "I heard voices downstairs, men's voices arguing with Papa. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. Her mismatched eyes met Sam's, filled with the haunted knowledge of terrible things witnessed. They said Papa had one last chance to pay what he owed. When he said he didn't have the money, one of them said, "Then you know what happens next." "What did you do?" "I hid in my room like a coward," Evangeline whispered, tears beginning to flow. "I heard Mama scream, then Papa, then nothing. When I finally got brave enough to come downstairs the next morning, they were both at the kitchen table, just sitting there like they were having breakfast, but their eyes..." She shuddered. "Their eyes were open, but they weren't seeing anything. There was foam around their mouths." Sam felt his jaw clench. "Poison." Evangeline nodded. "I ran to get the sheriff, but when he came back with me, he took one look at my parents and then at me, and I could see what he was thinking. Everyone in town always stared at my eyes, whispered about how unnatural they were. The sheriff said I must have poisoned them, that the devil had marked me from birth and finally claimed his due. And you ran. I tried to tell them about the men I'd heard, but nobody listened. Sheriff Barnes said I was making up stories to cover my own guilt. They locked me in the jail to wait for the territorial judge, but that night..." Evangeline's voice broke. "That night, a mob came. They said they weren't going to wait for a trial. They said everyone knew what I was, and they were going to make sure I never hurt anyone else." Sam's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen mob justice before, had watched fear and superstition turn decent people into something barely human. "How did you get away?" "Deputy Collins," Evangeline said quietly. "He was young, newer to town. He didn't believe I'd done it, so he left my cell unlocked when the mob came, told me to run and keep running. They chased me into the mountains and left me tied to that tree when they couldn't find their way back in the dark. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire." Sam studied Evangeline's face, the exhaustion etched in every line, the fear that never quite left her eyes, the way she held herself like she expected the world to strike her down at any moment. This wasn't the face of a killer. This was the face of a child who'd lost everything and been blamed for her own tragedy. "Those men who came to your house that night," Sam said carefully, "did you recognize their voices?" Evangeline shook her head. "They weren't from Copper Falls. They sounded different, like they came from back east somewhere." Sam stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the dense forest that surrounded his cabin. "There's been talk in these parts about loan sharks working the mining territories. Men who prey on desperate folks, then collect their debts in blood when the money runs dry. You believe me?" Evangeline's voice was so small, so hopeful, that it nearly broke Sam's heart. He turned back to her, seeing not the devil's daughter that Copper Falls had created, but a frightened girl who'd been failed by every adult who should have protected her. "I believe you. And I believe that whoever killed your parents is still out there, probably moving on to their next victim while you take the blame for their crime." For the first time since he'd found her, Evangeline's shoulders relaxed slightly. "What happens now?" Sam returned to his chair, his decision crystallizing with each word he spoke. "Now you heal. You eat, you rest, and you get strong again. Winter's coming, and these mountains don't forgive weakness. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll help you get somewhere safe. But for now, you stay here. I can't ask you to..." "You're not asking," Sam said firmly. "I'm offering. This cabin gets mighty quiet in the winter months. Might be nice to have some company for a change." Evangeline stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why anyone would show her such kindness. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you risk helping someone like me?" Sam thought of Martha and Thomas, of the life he'd lost and the isolation he'd chosen. He thought of the fear he'd seen in Evangeline's eyes and the courage it had taken for her to tell him her story. "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes the people the world calls cursed are just the ones who need blessing the most." Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the pine boughs with white. Inside the cabin, two damaged souls sat in comfortable silence, each recognizing in the other a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to be abandoned by the world and left to survive on nothing but stubborn hope. As the snow continued to fall, Sam realized that for the first time in 3 years, the approaching winter didn't fill him with dread. Instead, it felt like a promise, months of quiet healing, of shared meals and small conversations, of learning to trust again, and maybe, just maybe, of discovering that miracles sometimes came disguised as the very people everyone else had given up on. The snows came early that year, blanketing the Montana mountains in a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even thoughts. By November, drifts piled shoulder-high against Sam's cabin, and the world beyond his small clearing disappeared into a white wilderness that stretched endless in every direction. Inside the warm cabin, an unexpected routine had developed. Evangeline proved herself surprisingly capable despite her ordeal. She mended Sam's torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, a skill learned from her seamstress mother. She could cook surprisingly well over the wood stove, turning Sam's simple ingredients into meals that reminded him what it felt like to look forward to supper. Most remarkably, she could read, something uncommon for women in the territory, and she read aloud from Sam's small collection of books in the evenings while he worked on carving projects or mended tools. But it was in the quiet moments between tasks that Sam began to see past the walls Evangeline had built around herself. She would sometimes stop mid-sentence while reading, her mismatched eyes distant with memory. She startled at unexpected sounds, the crack of settling logs or the howl of wind through the eaves. And she never, ever talked about her plans for spring, as if speaking of the future might somehow jinx the fragile safety she'd found. "You don't have to be afraid here," Sam told her one evening as they sat by the fire. She jumped when a branch scraped against the window, her whole body tensing like a deer ready to bolt. "I know," Evangeline said, but her fingers twisted nervously in her skirt. "It's just, I keep thinking they'll find me, that they'll come for me even here." Sam looked up from the wooden bowl he was carving. "No one's coming through these mountains in winter. The snow's too deep, the cold too bitter. We're as safe as if we were on the moon." Evangeline managed a small smile at that. The moon might be preferable. At least there, I wouldn't have to worry about people thinking I was cursed. "You ever think," Sam said carefully, setting down his carving knife, "that maybe those eyes of yours aren't a curse? Maybe they're just different, like how some folks are born left-handed or with perfect pitch." Evangeline touched her face self-consciously. "Mama used to say they were beautiful, that God made me special." Her voice grew thick with unshed tears. "But Papa sometimes looked at me like he wasn't sure what I was." Sam felt anger flare in his chest, not at Evangeline, but at a world that could make a child feel ashamed of the way God had made her. "Your father was scared," he said gently. "Scared of what other people might think, scared of how they might treat his family. That fear made him weak, but it doesn't make you cursed." Before Evangeline could respond, the sound of voices carried through the winter air, faint but unmistakably human. Sam's blood ran cold. No one traveled these mountains in winter, unless they were desperate or hunting something they wanted very badly. Both of them froze, listening. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the crunch of boots through snow and the heavy breathing of men pushing through deep drifts. "She's here somewhere," a rough voice called out, closer than Sam had hoped. "Tracks lead right to this area." "Could be dead by now," another voice replied. "Been out here 2 months. Boss wants her found, dead or alive. Says she saw too much that night at her daddy's place." Sam's jaw clenched. These weren't townspeople from Copper Falls driven by superstition. These were the real killers, the men who'd murdered Evangeline's parents and now wanted to silence the only witness to their crime. Moving swiftly but silently, Sam grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and checked that it was loaded. "Get back in the bedroom," he whispered to Evangeline. "Hide under the bed and don't make a sound no matter what you hear." Evangeline's face had gone white as fresh snow. "They found me," she whispered. "They actually found me. They haven't found you yet," Sam said firmly. "And they're not going to. Now go." The voices were almost at his door now. At least 3 men, maybe 4. Sam positioned himself beside the window, rifle ready, and peered through a gap in the curtains. 4 figures in heavy coats struggled through the snow toward his cabin, their faces hard and determined. City men by the look of them, unused to mountain winters but driven by something stronger than comfort. A heavy fist pounded on his door. "Open up! We know someone's in there!" Sam waited, saying nothing. In the bedroom he could hear the soft sounds of Evangeline crawling under the bed, and he prayed she would stay hidden no matter what happened next. "We're looking for a girl," the voice continued. "Red hair, strange eyes, calls herself Evangeline Morrison. We know she's been through these parts." Still, Sam remained silent. The men outside muttered among themselves, their voices growing more agitated. "Maybe nobody's home," one suggested. Smoke's coming from the chimney and there's fresh wood chopped by the door, another replied. Someone's definitely here. The door rattled as someone tried the handle, then shook harder as they attempted to force it. Sam had built his cabin to withstand mountain winters and the occasional bear. It would take more than shoulder pressure to break it down. "You in there," the leader shouted. "We're not leaving until we search this place. You can open the door, or we can break it down. Your choice." Sam made his decision. These men had already murdered 2 people and left a 16-year-old girl to die in the wilderness. They weren't going to negotiate or be reasoned with. The only language they understood was force. He moved to the door and called out in his strongest voice. "This is private property. You're trespassing. Move along." "Can't do that, friend. We've got business to conduct." "Then you can conduct it from the other side of my rifle sights," Sam replied, working the action of his Winchester with a sound that carried clearly through the wooden door. A moment of silence followed, then urgent whispers. Sam caught fragments. "Didn't say anything about," and "just one man," and "boss wants her bad." Finally, the leader spoke again, his voice now carrying a note of false reasonableness. "Look, mister, we don't want any trouble with you. Just hand over the girl and we'll be on our way. Nobody needs to get hurt." "What girl?" Sam asked, though his heart was pounding so hard he was sure they could hear it. "Don't play stupid, Morrison girl. Evangeline, she's a killer, mister. Poisoned her own parents. We're here to bring her to justice." Sam's grip tightened on his rifle. "Justice? Or is this about covering up your own crimes?" Another silence. Longer this time. When the voice came again, it had lost all pretense of friendliness. "You've got 10 seconds to open this door or we're coming in anyway. And when we do, things are going to go very badly for anyone who gets in our way." Sam positioned himself behind his heavy wooden table, rifle trained on the door. In the bedroom, he could hear Evangeline's rapid, frightened breathing, and he found himself thinking of Martha and Thomas, of how he'd failed to protect them from the cholera that had taken their lives. He wouldn't fail again. Not this time. "Come ahead, then," Sam called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "But I promise you, the first man through that door won't live to see the second." The sound of feet moving through snow, of men positioning themselves around his cabin, told Sam that negotiation time was over. These killers had found their target, and they weren't leaving empty-handed. As he waited for their assault to begin, Sam found himself thinking about Evangeline's question from weeks ago. Why would you risk helping someone like me? Now, with armed killers at his door, and death a real possibility, Sam finally understood his own answer. Because some things were worth fighting for. Because innocence deserved protection. And because sometimes the greatest miracle wasn't being saved, it was finding something worth saving yourself. The door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire cabin, and Sam Hartwell prepared to fight for both their lives. The first man through the door caught Sam's rifle bullet square in the chest and dropped like a felled tree. The second stumbled over his partner's body, giving Sam precious seconds to work the lever action and fire again. The shot went wide, splintering the doorframe, but it sent the remaining men scrambling for cover outside. "You killed Jake," one of them shouted from behind the woodpile. "You're going to pay for that, mountain man." "He came through my door uninvited," Sam called back, already moving to a better position behind his stone fireplace. "Same thing'll happen to anyone else who tries it." Gunfire erupted from outside. 3 rifles at least, maybe 4. Bullets shattered his windows and thudded into the thick log walls. Sam kept low, counting shots, listening for the telltale clicks of empty chambers. These city men were wasting ammunition, firing wild in their anger. Mountain life had taught Sam patience and precision. During a lull in the shooting, he heard movement in the bedroom. Not Evangeline, but boots on wooden floor. His blood ran cold as he realized one of them had circled around to the back window. A scream pierced the air, high, terrified, unmistakably Evangeline's voice. Sam spun toward the bedroom as a rough voice shouted, "Got her! I got the devil girl!" Abandoning his cover, Sam rushed toward the bedroom just as a man emerged, dragging Evangeline by her hair. She was fighting like a wildcat, clawing at his face, but the man was twice her size and had a pistol pressed against her temple. "Drop your rifle, mountain man," the kidnapper snarled, "or I paint the walls with her brains." Sam froze, his Winchester halfway to his shoulder. The man holding Evangeline was lean and cruel-faced. with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His clothes marked him as city folk, probably from Denver or Colorado Springs, where loan sharks and enforcers made their living bleeding desperate people dry. "You're making a mistake," Sam said quietly, not lowering his rifle but not raising it further either. "She's just a kid. She never hurt anybody." "Kid saw too much the night we visited her daddy," the man replied. "Heard voices, probably saw faces. Can't have loose ends walking around, can we?" From outside, the other two men were growing impatient. "Bring her out, Dalton," one shouted. "We need to finish this and get back before the storm hits." Storm. Sam glanced toward the broken windows and saw what the killers had apparently missed in their single-minded pursuit. The sky had turned an ominous gray-black, and the wind was picking up. A genuine Montana blizzard was building, the kind that could bury a man in an hour and freeze him solid in two. "You boys picked a bad day for murder," Sam said, buying time while he studied the angles. "That's a killer storm moving in. You'll never make it back to civilization in this." Dalton's grip on Evangeline tightened. "We'll take our chances. Now drop that rifle before I—" Evangeline moved with desperate courage, slamming her elbow back into Dalton's ribs while simultaneously ducking away from his gun. The pistol fired wild, the bullet striking the cabin wall inches from Sam's head. But the distraction was all Sam needed. His rifle cracked and Dalton spun away from Evangeline, clutching his shattered shoulder. The man's pistol skittered across the floor as he collapsed, screaming in pain and rage. "You little witch," Dalton gasped. "You cursed demon." "She's no demon," Sam said, working his rifle's lever action as he moved to put himself between Evangeline and the wounded man. "She's just braver than you are." More gunfire erupted from outside, but now the wind was howling around the cabin, and Sam could hear the panic in the remaining killers' voices. The blizzard was arriving with the sudden fury that made Montana winters legendary. "Dalton! Dalton! Where are you?" one of them shouted over the wind. Their wounded companion tried to call out, but his voice was weak with shock and pain. Sam retrieved the man's fallen pistol and handed it to Evangeline, who took it with shaking but determined hands. "Can you use this if you have to?" Sam asked. Evangeline nodded, her mismatched eyes hard with resolve. "After what they did to my parents?" "Yes." The wind outside had become a full-throated roar and the temperature was dropping fast. Through his broken windows, Sam could see the world disappearing into a wall of white, the kind of storm that killed unprepared travelers. "Listen to me," Sam called out to the men outside. "That storm's going to bury you alive if you don't find shelter. There's a supply cache about 2 miles north of here, food, blankets, basic supplies. Follow the creek bed and you might make it." "Why help us?" came the shouted reply. "We came here to kill you both." Sam looked at Evangeline, seeing in her face the same struggle he felt in his own heart. These men were killers and worse, but they were also human beings about to face nature's ultimate judgment. "Because," Sam called back, "we're not like you." A long silence followed, broken only by the wind and Dalton's labored breathing. Finally, one of the remaining men shouted, "This isn't over, we'll be back come spring." But even as he said it, his voice was growing fainter, already moving away through the storm. Sam heard the distant sound of men struggling through deepening snow, their voices growing more desperate as the blizzard swallowed them. He moved to his broken windows and watched until even their shadows disappeared into the white fury. Then he turned his attention to Dalton, who was conscious but growing pale from blood loss. "We should let him die," Evangeline said quietly, still holding the pistol steady. "After what he did to my family." Sam studied her face, seeing the war between justice and mercy playing out in those remarkable eyes. "We could," he agreed, "and maybe we should. But if we do, how are we any different from them?" Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tired. "My mother always said that how we treat our enemies shows who we really are." Together they bound Dalton's wound and dragged him closer to the fire. He'd lost a lot of blood and was drifting in and out of consciousness, but he'd live, if the storm didn't kill them all. As Sam boarded up his broken windows and Evangeline prepared soup for their unwilling patient, the blizzard raged outside with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. "Do you think they'll really come back in spring?" Evangeline asked as they settled by the fire. Sam considered the question seriously. Those two that got away? If they survived the storm, maybe. But this Dalton fellow's going to have a lot of explaining to do when he gets back to whoever sent them. Might be his bosses decide the whole thing's more trouble than it's worth. Evangeline poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. And if they do come back, then we'll deal with it, Sam said simply. Together. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness sat in comfortable silence, each knowing that whatever the future held, they wouldn't face it alone. As the fire crackled and the wind howled, Sam realized that Evangeline had been right to call herself his miracle, not because she'd brought magic into his life, but because she'd brought something far more precious. The reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the whole world seemed set against you, there was still hope to be found in human kindness. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was miracle enough. 3 days later, when the storm finally passed and the world emerged pristine white under brilliant sunshine, Sam and Evangeline found the frozen bodies of the two remaining killers less than a mile from the cabin. They'd died as they'd lived, far from home, far from help, and far from grace. Dalton recovered enough to travel, and Sam personally escorted him to the territorial authorities in Helena, where the man's testimony about the Morrison murders finally cleared Evangeline's name. The loan sharks who'd ordered the killings were arrested and tried, bringing justice for crimes that had nearly destroyed an innocent girl's life. But by then, Sam and Evangeline had already decided that the remote cabin in the Montana mountains was exactly where they belonged. Two souls who'd found healing in each other's company, and who'd learned that sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as the most ordinary acts of human decency. As spring returned to the mountains and wildflowers bloomed where snow had buried the world in white, Sam Hartwell no longer considered himself a lonely lumberjack. He was simply a man who'd opened his door to someone the world had abandoned, and in doing so, had found his way back to life itself. What did you think of Sam and Evangeline's incredible journey from isolation to redemption? Their story proves that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the simplest acts of human kindness. If this tale of courage, second chances, and finding family in the most unexpected places touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit. Your support helps us bring these meaningful tales to life, and there are many more incredible stories waiting to be told. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable adventure in the Montana wilderness.